When I think about terms for my research, I really think about students moving among communities of practice, among in between. I sometimes use the word transfer if that's a concept that audiences that I'm talking with have heard or they use. I'm not particularly married to one term or another. I tend to think about getting to the meat and potatoes of my research, to use a term that you used before, which really has to do with the importance of identifying and recognizing these boundaries around communities of practice, or even for some audiences, identifying that communities of practice exist and that all learning and functioning and operating happens within these communities of practice. So if people want to talk about that as transfer, I'm happy to talk about it as transfer. If they want to talk about that as transformation, I'm happy to talk about it as transformation, whatever works for them.
I actually, unlike a lot of people, think we should keep the term transfer. And it's not because I think it's necessarily an accurate term. It's because if we want to engage in conversations with people outside of the discipline and we change the term, we are no longer part of those conversations. And so I think that inside articles or attaching other terms to transfer, like expansive learning, preparation for future learning, there's many different terms, boundary crossing, you could go on and on. I think that we should definitely keep our minds open and as a field develop a set of terms, because I think what's happening is that transfer itself is very limited. It's like take knowledge one place, take it to the other. But the act of doing that is so diverse. Are you adapting it? Are you not? How do dispositions get in the way or facilitate it? So it's a very complex act that we're trying to boil down to a very simple term. And that, of course, is going to fail. But I think for the purposes of engaging in research and scholarship that leaves our field and that has conversations with other people that are in math and science and educational research, we have to keep using the term, and failing to do so kind of takes us out of that conversation. So that's my take on it, but I don't necessarily think the term is a good term. I just think that that's the term that everyone else is using, and we have to maintain that to some extent.
I am much fonder now of the language of integration, which is one of the theories that Rebecca Nowacek has offered to us, I think. I've always really liked the language of agency. I much have preferred that over power. I've never really liked the model that's been implicit in power and empowering students. So I've always really been fond of the notion of agency.
We had an interesting discussion about transfer and transformative, and the notion of maybe what we're doing is trying to talk about transformative knowledge or tools that allow students to transform prior knowledge, or what allows students to transform their learning experiences. And so transformance almost became as much as transference a key word for us. I'm not quite sure that we want to give up transfer yet, because particularly in the ed psychology literature, transfer is such a key word that's already established. So we didn't want to lose it, but for us it seems like the data and looking at the student sample text and the student interviews, particularly starting to think about the contrast that we're noticing between the upper division students and the first year comp students, the way they talk. They'll, for instance, all talk about a thesis statement, but the students in the first year comp will often talk about a thesis as like an easy, solid, knowable thing with 3 supporting points. And by the time the students are in their upper division writing the disciplines courses, they're still using thesis. They're actually using it, though, in a much more skilled, and here I'll go, a transformed fashion, where they're talking about how it relates to what they're trying to do in sociology. They might talk, instead of about a thesis with 3 supporting points, a 2-part thesis statement or a qualified thesis statement. And that, to me, is transforming a concept that they grabbed in, maybe not just in first year writing, but in their high school writing class, but they've transformed that and they're now applying it in a different way.
I think the term transfer is both useful and exceedingly complicated. For me, it's most useful when I think of it as a really big tent. There are lots of things that we mean when we talk about transfer, and I think of it generally as a process of making connections. But I think if we want to have the conversations that we really want to have, we need additional vocabularies to fill out all of the areas that fall under that big tent. So for me, the thing that I've been really interested in thinking about is the language that I'm grappling with right now is bricolage, an idea of sort of piecing together how individuals, when they're facing new contexts, I think a lot about how people draw on genre knowledge and how they use that genre knowledge and conversations about the kinds of knowledge they have to figure out what are the ways in which this is applicable, what are the ways in which this works in the new situation, and what are the limits of this genre knowledge? What are the ways in which maybe if I use some strategies from here and some strategies from here and some from here, I might be able to come up with a way of addressing this new situation appropriately. I think the language of transfer invites us to think about application. It just comes from here to there, but it's actually an infinitely more complicated process. And so it's useful as a big tent, but we need a lot more work on sort of figuring out what goes on in the various corners of that big tent.
Instead of coming up with alternate terms for transfer, really start thinking about what are all the different things that are happening in moments when we use prior knowledge, and trying to sort of lay out what each of those phenomenon are. And so I think transfer is perfectly fine for describing the sort of unconscious reuse of prior knowledge, but then, other terms like recontextualizing, generalizing, repurposing, and then repurposing for expansive learning, when it's not even just about reusing or repurposing prior knowledge, but also having to learn something new also in order to be able to do what you're trying to do currently. So I think all of those terms and probably many more would help us kind of get at all the things that are happening in these moments where we're trying to reuse prior knowledge.